The rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Chicago apartment usually felt like a protective barrier, keeping the chaos of the world at bay while they enjoyed their Merlot. But tonight, when Elena walked through the door clutching her side, her face pale and her breathing shallow, the sanctuary fractured. She said she had slipped on the wet pavement outside the gallery. A simple, clumsy accident that anyone could have. Yet as she turned away to hide her phone, David noticed her hands weren't shaking from shock. They were shaking from the adrenaline of a lie she hadn't fully rehearsed. There is a specific kind of silence that fills a room when a marriage is dying. Not with a bang, but with a secret that is already bleeding out into the open. If you find yourself drawn to the jagged edges of broken trust and the quiet storms behind closed doors, stay with me. The rain in Chicago didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker, turning the city lights into blurred, weeping streaks against the glass. David stood by the kitchen island, the smell of roasted garlic and rosemary failing to warm the chill that had settled in his chest since 6 p.m. It was now past 8:30. The bottle of Cabernet he'd opened to breathe had been breathing for too long, teetering on the edge of vinegar. When the lock finally tumbled, the sound was louder than usual in the quiet apartment. Elena stepped inside. She didn't call out his name. That was the first thing David noticed. Usually her "I'm home" was a melody, a signal that the workday performance was over and they could be themselves. Tonight, there was only the heavy thud of the door closing and the wet slap of her boots on the hardwood. "Elle?" David walked into the hallway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Elena was leaning against the wall, one hand pressed hard against her lower abdomen, her knuckles white. Her coat was soaked, her blonde hair plastered to her forehead in erratic strands. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. "I'm okay," she said, before he could even ask. Her voice was brittle, like dry leaves stepping on gravel. "I'm okay. I took a spill." "A spill?" David was at her side in 2 strides, his hands hovering over her but not landing, afraid to touch the wrong spot. "Where? The stairs at the gallery?" "Outside," she winced, shifting her weight away from him. "The pavement was slick. I landed hard on my side. It's just bruised, David. I'm fine." "You're pale, Elena. You look like you're about to pass out." He gently took her coat. She flinched when his hand brushed her shoulder, a sharp, instinctive recoil that she tried to disguise as a shiver. "I went to urgent care," she said quickly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "They checked me out. No broken bones. Just soft tissue damage. They gave me something for the pain." David frowned. "Which urgent care? The one on State Street?" "No. One closer to the client meeting I had. North Side," she finally looked at him, and for a second, David saw a raw terror in her eyes that didn't match a simple fall. It looked like guilt. It looked like survival. "I just need to lie down, David. Please. No questions tonight. I'm exhausted." He watched her limp toward the bedroom. Her walk was wrong. If she had fallen on her side, she would favor the hip or the shoulder. But she was walking gingerly, with the careful, shuffling gait of someone protecting their core, someone who had been hollowed out. David followed her, the protective husband mode engaging automatically, overriding the suspicion that pricked at the back of his neck. He helped her out of her boots. She sat on the edge of the bed, trembling. "Let me get you some water," he said softly, "and the heating pad." Ice, she corrected sharply. Then softer. Ice is better for inflammation. When David returned with the ice pack and a glass of water, Elena was already under the duvet, curled into a tight ball facing away from his side of the bed. Her phone was clutched in her hand, the screen facing the mattress. "Elle," he whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. He placed a hand on her hip. She stiffened. "David, please. It hurts." "I'm sorry." He pulled his hand back as if burned. I was worried. You didn't answer my texts." "I told you," she mumbled into the pillow, her voice thick with impending sleep or suppressed tears. "I was at the clinic. The reception was bad." David sat there for a long time, listening to the rain hammer against the window. He watched the rise and fall of her breathing, waiting for the rhythm of deep sleep. When it finally came, he stood up quietly to clear the room. He picked up her purse from the floor where she'd dropped it. It was heavy, soaked through at the bottom. As he moved to set it on the vanity, the flap fell open. A crumpled piece of paper tumbled out. David bent down to pick it up. It was a discharge summary, standard trifold paper. He smoothed it out against his palm. The logo at the top wasn't an urgent care. It was the Fairview Women's Wellness Center. He stared at the header. Patient, Elena Vance. Time of discharge, 7:15 p.m. His eyes scanned down to the discharge instructions. They were generic, mostly cut off by a coffee stain, but the attending physician's name was clear. Dr. S. Cady. David looked at his sleeping wife. A fall on the pavement. A women's clinic. The math didn't add up. The silence in the room suddenly felt deafening, a vacuum sucking the air out of his lungs. He placed the paper on the nightstand, weighted down by her water glass, and walked out of the room, the darkness of the hallway swallowing him whole. He didn't know that across the city, in a high-rise condo overlooking the same rainy skyline, a woman named Sarah was logging into the Fairview secure portal from her laptop, a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes narrowing as she clicked on a file marked New Incident Reports. David sat on the beige linen sofa, the only light in the living room coming from the glow of his laptop screen. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic dripping against the glass, a ticking clock measuring out the minutes of his insomnia. On the coffee table, the crumpled discharge paper sat like a piece of evidence in a trial he hadn't realized he was conducting. He typed Fairview Women's Wellness Center into the search bar. The results populated instantly. The homepage featured soft pastels, images of smiling women holding yoga mats, and a clear, bold mission statement. Excellence in reproductive health, fertility, and gynecological surgery. There was no mention of urgent care, no mention of orthopedics, no trauma unit for women who slipped on wet pavement and bruised their ribs. David felt a cold prickle of sweat at his hairline. He clicked on the Staff tab and scrolled until he found Dr. S. Cady. The photo showed a stern-looking woman in a white coat. Her specialization was listed directly underneath: obstetrics and gynecological intervention. He closed the laptop, the snap echoing in the silent apartment. The wine in his glass had gone warm and bitter. He looked down the hallway toward the bedroom where Elena was sleeping. The fall was a lie. The bruised ribs were a cover. But for what? A cyst? A scare? Why lie about a health issue unless the cause of the issue was something she couldn't share with him? The silence of the apartment, usually his sanctuary, now felt like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Across the city, in a penthouse that smelled faintly of lemon verbena and expensive leather, Sarah poured herself a second glass of sparkling water. She preferred clarity when she worked. As the newly appointed administrative director for the clinic's oversight board, Sarah's job was to look for inefficiencies, billing errors, redundant testing, liability risks. She was good at it. She approached the data rows on her monitor with the same detached precision she applied to her marriage to Marcus. Keep things orderly, presentable, and functioning. She scrolled through the daily intake log for the North Side branch. Most were routine. Annuals, prescriptions, a few surgical follow-ups. Then her cursor hovered over a name that triggered a synapse fire in the back of her brain. Patient ID 09942. Name Vance, Elena. Sarah's hand froze on the trackpad. She knew the name. Elena Vance, the art dealer. Marcus had bought 3 pieces from her gallery in the last 6 months. He had called her visionary. He had mentioned her name with a casual frequency that Sarah had noted, filed away, and chosen to ignore because Marcus was a man who liked shiny, talented things. But why was the visionary art dealer at a discreet women's clinic at 4:30 p.m. on a Tuesday? Sarah clicked the file open. The digital hourglass spun for a second before the clinical notes filled the screen. Chief complaint: abdominal cramping, bleeding. Procedure: D&C, dilation and curettage, for incomplete spontaneous abortion. Gestational age: 7 weeks. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her extremities numb. 7 weeks. She did the mental math instantly. 7 weeks ago, Marcus had been on a business trip to Aspen. Elena Vance had been there for an art fair. Sarah forced herself to breathe, her chest tight. She scrolled down to the discharge protocol section, looking for the liability waiver. The clinic required a designated driver for patients undergoing sedation. Patient released to M. Sterling. Relationship to patient. Emergency contact. Partner. The world stopped. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren of a police car, the beat of her own heart. It all ceased. M. Sterling. Marcus. He hadn't just slept with her. He hadn't just bought her paintings. He had been there, in the waiting room, holding her hand or pacing the floor while she lost his child. Sarah stared at the screen until her eyes burned. She didn't cry. Tears were for people who were surprised, and deep down, in the darkest corner of her intuition, Sarah realized she wasn't surprised. She was just armed. She reached for her phone, not to call her husband, who was currently asleep in the master bedroom down the hall, but to take a high-resolution photo of the screen. The flash reflected off the monitor, a harsh burst of light capturing the truth that would dismantle 2 marriages. She saved the photo to a hidden folder. Then, she picked up her sparkling water and took a sip. It was crisp, cold, and clarifying. The morning light in Chicago was gray and unforgiving, stripping away the shadows that had softened the apartment the night before. David stood at the kitchen island, staring at the coffee machine as it hissed and sputtered. He hadn't slept. Every time he had closed his eyes, the image of the discharge paper, Fairview Women's Wellness, had flashed behind his eyelids like a warning sign on a highway. Elena emerged from the bedroom around 9:00 a.m. She was wearing his oversized cashmere sweater, walking with that same guarded stiffness, holding her abdomen. "How are you feeling?" David asked. His voice sounded calm, almost clinical. He was surprised by how easily the mask slid into place. Elena flinched slightly at the sound of his voice before forcing a weak smile. Better. Still sore. The bruising is ugly. Let me see, David said, moving toward her. I should check it. Make sure the swelling hasn't spread. Elena took a step back, her hand tightening on the hem of the sweater. No, David. It's fine. I just applied some cream. I don't want to mess it up. She moved past him to the kettle, avoiding his eyes. The rejection was physical, a wall of cold air between them. David watched her back, the way her shoulders hunched protectively. It wasn't the posture of someone nursing a bruise. It was the posture of someone nursing a loss. I called the urgent care on State Street, David lied, watching her reflection in the caisson, darkened window. They said they didn't have a record of you coming in. I wanted to check if you needed a follow-up. Elena froze. The spoon in her mug clinked loudly against the ceramic. She turned slowly, her face draining of the little color it had regained. I told you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't go to State Street. I went to the one near the client meeting, on the north side. Right, David said, holding her gaze. Right. I forgot. He didn't press. He didn't scream. He just let the lie hang there, heavy and suffocating. He saw the panic flare in her eyes, the terrified calculation of a woman realizing her story had holes. Miles away, Sarah sat in her glass-walled office at the clinic's administrative headquarters. The city buzzed below her, oblivious and chaotic. On her dual monitors, she had pulled up the security archives for the previous afternoon. She didn't need to do this. The log had been enough. M. Sterling. But pain has a way of demanding witnesses. She needed to see it. She typed in the timestamp, 16:45. The footage from camera 3, the private exit leading to the parking garage, flickered to life. The image was grainy, black and white, but the figures were unmistakable. The door opened. A nurse held it wide. Then Marcus appeared. He wasn't the Marcus Sarah knew, the distracted, efficient husband who checked his watch during dinner. This Marcus was attentive. He was supporting a woman who could barely walk. His arm was wrapped firmly around her waist, taking her weight. He leaned in close, whispering something into her hair. Elena Vance looked shattered. She was weeping, her head resting on Marcus's shoulder as he guided her toward his black sedan. But it was what happened next that broke Sarah. Before helping Elena into the car, Marcus stopped. He cupped Elena's face in both hands and kissed her forehead. It wasn't a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound intimacy, of shared grief. It was the kind of tenderness he hadn't shown Sarah in years. Sarah watched her husband comfort his mistress over the loss of their child. The silence in her office was absolute. She paused the video on that frame, Marcus's hands on another woman's face. She looked at the timestamp. At 4:48 p.m. he was holding Elena. At 7:00 p.m. he had walked into their home and asked Sarah what was for dinner. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't throw the monitor. She simply reached for her phone, opened the contact for David Vance, landscape architecture, which she had found on LinkedIn minutes earlier, and stared at the number. She wasn't ready to call. Not yet. She needed to know the man she was about to destroy. 3 days later, the air in David's office felt stagnant, recycled through the vents of the high-rise building without ever truly refreshing. He sat at his drafting table, a set of blueprints for a rooftop garden in the Gold Coast spread out before him. The lines of the trellis design blurred together. He wasn't seeing pergolas or limestone pavers. He was seeing the timestamps on Elena's phone bill, which he had scrutinized until 3 a.m. the night before. There were gaps, hours of silence in the middle of the day. And then the calls to a number he didn't recognize, always brief, always followed by a text. "Mr. Vance?" His assistant's voice cut through the static in his head. David looked up, blinking. "Your 10 a.m. consultation is here. Ms. Harrow." David rubbed his face, forcing the exhaustion back behind a mask of professional interest. "Right. Send her in." He stood up, buttoning his blazer, as the glass door opened. The woman who walked in was striking, but not in the warm, chaotic way Elena was. This woman was architectural. Sharp lines, tailored navy suit, dark hair pulled back into a severe, perfect knot. She carried herself with the terrifying poise of someone who never made a mistake, or at least, never let one be seen. "Mr. Vance?" she said, extending a hand. Her grip was cool and firm. "Sarah Harrow, thank you for fitting me in." "It's a pleasure," David lied smoothly, gesturing to the leather chairs by the window. "Please sit. My assistant mentioned you're looking to redesign a terrace." "I need a renovation," Sarah said, sitting down and crossing her legs. She placed a sleek leather portfolio on the table. "My husband and I have a property in Lincoln Park. The garden, it's overgrown. It has too many shadows. I want everything stripped back. I want clarity." David nodded, picking up his notepad. "Clarity we can do. Are you looking for something minimalist? Japanese influence?" "I'm looking for something that nothing can hide in," she said. Her eyes, a piercing shade of hazel, locked onto his. "My husband travels frequently. He's a developer. He likes things expansive, but I'm the one who has to live in it." David paused, his pen hovering over the paper. There was an intensity in her voice that felt disproportionate to a gardening consultation. "I understand. It's important that the space reflects the person who spends the most time there." "Exactly," Sarah said. She let her gaze drift around his office, taking in the framed awards, the messy stacks of sketches, and finally, the silver-framed photograph on the corner of his desk. It was a picture of him and Elena from 2 years ago, taken in Napa. Elena was laughing, her head thrown back, looking radiant and innocent. "Your wife?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the photo. David stiffened. "Yes, Elena." "She's stunning," Sarah said. Her tone was flat, impossible to read. "You look very happy. It's rare to see that kind of transparency in a marriage these days." David felt a sudden, sharp pang in his chest. "That was a few years ago." "And now?" Sarah asked. It was a boundary crossed, a question too personal for a first meeting, yet she asked it with such clinical curiosity that David found himself answering before he could stop. "Now, we're busy," David said, his voice tight. "Life gets complicated." "It does," Sarah agreed. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "My husband Marcus thinks complications are just opportunities for leverage. But I think some things are just broken, Mr. Vance. And you can't plant flowers over concrete and expect them to grow." David looked at her, really looked at her. For a second, he felt a strange kinship with this cold, beautiful stranger. She seemed to carry a weight that mirrored his own. "I can design a new foundation, Ms. Harrow," David said quietly. "If the soil is bad, we replace it." Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good. That's exactly what I'm hoping for. I want to tear it all up and start over." She stood up, smoothing her skirt. I think we're going to work well together, David. I'll have my assistant send over the site plans. I'd like you to come see the property personally, soon. I can make time next week, David said. Make it this Friday, Sarah countered. My husband will be away. It will be easier to assess the damage without him there. As she turned to leave, the scent of her perfume lingered in the air, crisp, lemony, and sharp. David watched her go, feeling a strange unease settle in his stomach. He looked back at the photo of Elena. The laughter in the picture suddenly looked like a performance. He didn't know that as Sarah walked to the elevator, she was already typing a note into her phone. He suspects, but he's weak. He still loves her. We'll have to fix that. The physical pain had faded into a dull, rhythmic ache, easily managed with over-the-counter ibuprofen, but the psychological rot was setting in. Elena stood in the center of her gallery, surrounded by minimalist sculptures that suddenly felt oppressive, like jagged thoughts made solid. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, a new habit she had developed, as if she could hide the pulse jumping in her throat. The bell above the door chimed. It wasn't a customer. Marcus walked in. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than David's car, and he moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the pavement he walked on. He didn't look at the art. He looked at her. You haven't answered my texts, he said, his voice low, intimate, and terrifyingly calm. Elena took a step back, checking the empty showroom. Marcus, you can't be here, I told you. It's done. It's not done, he said, closing the distance. He didn't touch her, but he leaned close enough that she could smell the sandalwood and expensive scotch on his breath, the scent of her mistakes. You don't get to erase a year of us just because things got complicated last week. Complicated? Elena whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and revulsion. I lost a child, Marcus. Your child. I lay on a table in a clinic while my husband thought I fell on the sidewalk. I can't do this anymore. I can't look at David. David doesn't know you, Marcus sneered, softly. He knows the version of you that plays house. I know the rest. He reached out, his fingers grazing her elbow. You're upset. You're hormonal. We'll let it settle. But don't think you can just walk away. He left a card on the pedestal next to a bronze statue, a room key for the Palmer house, and walked out. Elena stared at the card, feeling the nausea rise in her throat. She wasn't free. She was infected. Miles away, David was staring at his phone. He had been exchanging texts with Sarah Harrow regarding the garden project. She was demanding, precise, and oddly engaging. Sarah, I'm looking at the stone samples. The gray slate is too cold. It hides nothing. I prefer the limestone. It's porous. It absorbs everything, eventually. David typed back. Limestone stains easily. Sarah. Everything stains, David. Most people just paint over it. My husband is excellent at painting over things. I assume you're luckier. The message sat on his screen, blinking. I assume you're luckier. It was a casual remark, but it hooked into the soft underbelly of David's doubt. He thought about Elena's fall. He thought about the North Side Clinic. He thought about the way she turned off her phone screen the second he walked into a room. That evening, the atmosphere in the apartment was brittle. Elena was chopping vegetables with a manic intensity, the knife hitting the cutting board in rapid staccato bursts. How was the gallery? David asked, leaning against the counter. He watched her hands. They were shaking. Fine. Quiet, she said, not looking up. Just some tourists? No collectors? No. David paused. He had seen the transaction alert on their joint credit card account an hour ago. A charge for a coffee shop next to her gallery at 4:00 p.m. But 10 minutes later, a secondary charge for a parking garage downtown, nowhere near her gallery. I was thinking, David said slowly, testing the weight of the words. Since your ribs are still healing, maybe I should drive you to work tomorrow. Pick you up too. Elena the knife stopped. She turned to him, her smile tight and unnatural. That's sweet, David. But I have a lot of errands to run. I need the car. Errands? Just supplies. Framing. On the north side again? The air left the room. Elena's eyes widened, just a fraction. It was the micro-expression of a liar caught in the headlights. Why do you keep asking about that? She snapped, defensive anger flaring up to cover the fear. I told you, it was one time. Why are you interrogating me? I'm not interrogating you, David said, his voice level, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. I'm just trying to understand why my wife feels like a stranger. He saw it then, the flicker of panic. She turned back to the cutting board, but she didn't resume chopping. She just stood there, staring at the peppers, breathing hard. The infection had spread to him now. He knew she was lying. He just didn't know how deep the rot went. The courier arrived at David's office at 2:15 p.m. It was a standard bike messenger service, the kind that wove through the gridlock of the loop with aggressive efficiency. The envelope was plain manila, marked only with David's name and personal confidential. David sat at his desk, the hum of the office fading into white noise as he slid his finger under the flap. He expected legal documents for the new riverfront project. Instead, he pulled out a single sheet of glossy photo paper. It was a still frame from a security camera. The timestamp in the corner read, Tuesday, 4:42 p.m. The location was labeled Fairview Medical Center, P2 Garage Elevator. The image showed Elena standing by her car. She wasn't falling. She wasn't clutching her side in agony. She was checking her makeup in the side mirror, looking anxious but physically perfect. She was wearing the coat she had come home in later that night, the one she claimed was muddy from a fall on the sidewalk. There was no note, no return address, just the cold, hard proof that at the exact moment she claimed to be tumbling down gallery steps, she was parking her car at a women's clinic on the north side. David felt a physical blow to his chest, a hollow thud that knocked the wind out of him. He didn't scream. He didn't throw the picture. He simply placed it back in the envelope, picked up his keys, and walked out of the office. He left his computer on, his coffee steaming, and his career temporarily abandoned. When he unlocked the apartment door an hour later, the silence was heavy. Elena was on the sofa, scrolling through her iPad, a glass of water on the coaster. She looked up, surprised by his early arrival. David? Is everything okay? He didn't answer. He walked to the coffee table and dropped the photograph on top of her magazine. Stop lying, he said. His voice was terrifyingly quiet. Just stop. Elena looked at the photo. Her face went slack. For a moment, there was no sound but the hum of the refrigerator. She stared at the timestamp, the location, the undeniable reality of her own reflection. Where did you get this? she whispered, her voice trembling. It doesn't matter, David said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides to stop them from shaking. You weren't at the gallery. You didn't fall. You were at Fairview. Who is he, Elena? Is it a colleague? A client? Elena stood up, the iPad sliding to the floor with a clatter. She looked trapped, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit. It's not what you think, she stammered. Don't, David snapped. Don't tell me it's not what I think. You lied about being hurt. You lied about where you were. You lied about the doctor. Just tell me his name so I can leave. There is no he, Elena screamed, the sound tearing through the apartment. Tears erupted instantly, not the calculated tears of the night before, but a hysterical, jagged sobbing. There is no one else, David. Then why were you there? David yelled back, his restraint finally snapping. Why lie about a medical clinic? Elena took a ragged breath, clutching her chest. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. Because I found a lump. The words hung in the air, sucking the anger out of the room instantly. David froze. What? I found a lump, Elena sobbed, sinking back onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. In the shower. 2 weeks ago, I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to make it real until I knew. I went to Fairview for a biopsy. That's why I was in pain. The procedure. It hurt. I lied because I was scared, David. I was so scared. David stood there, the photograph on the table suddenly looking like an accusation against him. The adrenaline that had been fueling his rage turned into a cold, heavy sludge of shame. A lump. A biopsy. While he had been hunting for a lover, she had been facing mortality. Elena. His voice broke. I didn't want you to look at me like I was sick, she wept, rocking back and forth. I wanted to be sure before I ruined everything. It was a masterstroke of improvisation. It was a lie built on the architecture of his worst fears. And as David looked at his weeping wife, the suspicion in his gut didn't disappear, but it was buried under a landslide of guilt. He crossed the room and knelt before her, reaching for her hands, hating himself for the doubt that still lingered in the back of his mind. The truce in the apartment was made of glass, transparent, beautiful, and incredibly fragile. For 3 days, David had been the model of a devoted husband. He had canceled his meetings. He had cooked dinner. He had stopped asking questions about the timeline or the phone calls, terrified that his suspicion had added stress to a wife facing a biopsy. He walked on eggshells, treating Elena not as a partner who had lied to him, but as a patient he had failed to protect. They were eating in silence. Roast chicken and vegetables, a domestic tableau that felt staged. Elena looked better. The color had returned to her cheeks, bolstered by the relief of having successfully diverted a catastrophe. She believed the storm had passed. She believed that the lie about the lump was a fortress that could hold off the truth forever. David's phone buzzed on the mahogany table. He ignored it. He was done with distractions. He wanted to focus on her, on them. You're not eating much, David said softly, gesturing to her plate. I'm just tired. Elena managed a small, brave smile. The stress of waiting for the results, it's exhausting. We'll get through it, David promised, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. Whatever the doctor says, we handle it together. The phone buzzed again, then a third time, a persistent rhythmic vibration that demanded attention. David frowned. Sorry, I should check that. It might be the site foreman. He picked up the phone. It wasn't a text. It was an email notification. The sender was unfamiliar. Harrow. David didn't make the connection immediately. Sarah Harrow. The client with the limestone terrace. The woman who wanted everything stripped back to clarity. He unlocked the screen. The subject line was blank. There was no body text. Just a single PDF attachment labeled Patient Records Unredacted EV PDF. David's thumb hovered over the file. A cold premonition washed over him, a prickling sensation at the base of his neck that had nothing to do with architecture. He looked at Elena. She was taking a sip of wine, her eyes closed, looking peaceful. He tapped the file. The document loaded. It was the same header he had seen on the crumpled receipt. Fairview Women's Wellness Center. But this wasn't a discharge summary. It was the full surgical report. Patient name, Elena Vance. Attending physician, Dr. S. Cady. Date of procedure, October 14th. David read the lines, his breath catching in his throat. Preoperative diagnosis, incomplete spontaneous abortion. Postoperative diagnosis, same. Procedure performed, suction dilation and curettage. Gestational age, 7 weeks plus 2 days. Conception. Window, August 20th, August 25th. The world tilted. The sounds of the city outside, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic, vanished. All David could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. August 20th. He looked up at the ceiling, doing the math that no husband should ever have to do. In late August, he had been in Seattle for the Landscape Architecture Conference. He had been gone for 10 days. He hadn't touched Elena in 3 weeks around that time because of the deadline stress. There was no lump. There was no cancer. There was no biopsy. There was a baby that wasn't his. He scrolled down further. At the bottom of the page, there was a section for genetic screening, paternity markers, optional. It was blank, but next to it, in the billing information section, a credit card was listed. Card holder, Marcus Sterling. The name meant nothing to him, and yet, it meant everything. It was the name of the man who had paid to erase the evidence. David lowered the phone slowly. The empathy that had filled him for days, the guilt that had kept him awake at night, the tenderness he had poured into this marriage, it all evaporated. In its place was a cold, absolute clarity. Elena opened her eyes. She saw his face. The color she had regained drained away instantly. She didn't need to see the screen. She knew that look. It wasn't the look of a worried husband anymore. It was the look of a man who had just watched a ghost walk into the room. "David?" she whispered, the wine glass trembling in her hand. "What is it?" David didn't scream. He didn't flip the table. He felt strangely calm, the way a person feels after a car crash, before the pain registers. "You don't have cancer, Elena," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was a statement of fact, like reading the weather report. Elena froze. "What?" "You don't have a lump," he continued, looking directly into her eyes. "You had a miscarriage, 7 weeks along, conceived while I was in Seattle." The glass slipped from Elena's hand. It hit the edge of the plate and shattered, red wine splashing across the white tablecloth like a gunshot wound. She didn't move to clean it up. She sat paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing, no sound coming out. "Who is Marcus Sterling?" David asked. He didn't yell the name. He just placed it on the table between them, heavy and undeniable. Elena flinched as if he had struck her. The lie was dead. The cancer was dead. The marriage was dead. All that was left was the mess on the table. The red wine continued to spread across the white tablecloth, a slow-moving Rorschach test that neither of them tried to stop. It dripped onto the oak floor, the only sound in the room besides Elena's ragged breathing. "David." She tried again, her voice cracking. She reached for him, but her hand stopped in mid-air, paralyzed by the wall of ice radiating from him. "Please, let me explain who he is. It's not love. It was a mistake. It was a stupid, reckless mistake." David stood up. He didn't look at her. He looked at the wine stain. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning, Elena. A mistake is crashing the car." He finally raised his eyes to hers, and they were terrifyingly empty. Sleeping with a client is a choice. Getting pregnant is a consequence. But telling me you had a tumor? Using my fear for your life to cover up your infidelity? He shook his head slowly, a ghost of a bitter smile touching his lips. "That's not a mistake. That's cruelty. That is a deliberate, calculated cruelty." "I was scared," she sobbed, finally breaking. "I didn't know how to tell you without losing you." "You lost me the moment you decided I was a fool," David said. He turned and walked toward the bedroom. Elena scrambled out of her chair, following him, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood. She watched from the doorway as he pulled his weekender bag from the top shelf of the closet. The sound of the zipper opening was loud, final. He didn't pack everything. He wasn't stripping the house. He moved with the efficiency of a man who only needed to survive the night. A few shirts, his laptop, the charger, his toiletries kit. "David, don't do this," Elena pleaded, leaning against the doorframe, her body sagging. "We can fix this. People fix this. We can go to therapy. I'll cut him off. I swear, I'll never see him again." Sarah must have sent that, right? She's trying to ruin us because she's angry. Don't let her win. David paused, a gray shirt in his hand. He looked at the bed where he had sat just a few nights ago, holding her hand, thinking she was dying. He remembered the weight of his own grief, how heavy it had felt, how real. "She didn't ruin us, Elle," he said quietly. "She just turned on the lights." He zipped the bag. He walked past her without touching her. The air between them felt charged, static with all the words that didn't need to be said. At the front door, he stopped. He fished his keys out of his pocket and placed them on the console table, right next to the bowl where they kept the mail. The metal clinked against the wood, a tiny sound that signaled the end of a decade. "David," she whispered. It was a sound of pure desolation. He opened the door. The hallway outside was bright and sterile, a stark contrast to the dim, suffocating atmosphere of the apartment. "I'll have my lawyer contact you," he said. He didn't say "I love you." He didn't say "I hate you." He simply stepped out and closed the door. The latch clicked. Elena stood in the hallway for a long time. She waited for the sound of the elevator dings. She waited for the sound of his footsteps returning. She waited for the anger to come, or the relief, or the panic, but nothing came. She walked back into the dining room. The wine had stopped dripping. The stain was setting, permanent and dark. She sat down in her chair, the glass shards glittering on the floor near her feet. The apartment was perfectly silent. The rain had stopped, leaving only the damp, cold night pressing against the windows. She touched her stomach, where there was no baby, no tumor, and no pain anymore. There was nothing. She had played the game, she had spun the lies, and she had survived the sickness. But as she looked around the beautiful, empty rooms of her life, Elena realized that the diagnosis was terminal after all. She was alone.